100 years ago, I knew this one poet.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week, I have a pretty special guest on, somebody I've been wanting to have on for a while, and I think you will really enjoy him. So I went to the University of Georgia for my undergraduate education, and it was there that I met Ryan Wilson, who's a poet, editor, teacher that a lot of you already know. So the creative writing program at Georgia, I would characterize as a sort of a nonsense forward post-avant language poetry inflected variety or style. That seemed to be kind of what dominated in the department at the time. It was headed up by Brian Henry, who's a poet and professor. He's still around today. He was very young. He was like 4.5 years older than me, it felt like at the time. Also a big Australia-phile, though not maybe not all the same Australian circles as are affiliated with this show. So Ryan and I sort of found ourselves splitting off from this mode and writing a lot of kind of I don't know what you would call it, like narrative free verse mostly. Ryan wrote a little bit in form at the time, kind of, like Southern sentimental narrative talky poetry. The term we used at the time was sense-making poetry, or like things mattering poetry, which at the time felt very much outside the norm. So while we were there, however, there was another poet I knew of mostly through Ryan, who was maybe a little bit older than me, but he was also doing something very different than the norm. And I remember it was one of the first times I had this feeling. I read some of his poems junior, senior year. He went straight from Georgia to the Iowa Writers Workshop. Like, he was probably really still like the only real poetry star to emerge from University of Georgia's undergraduate creative writing program that I know of. Maybe like Seth Parker and Natalie Lyonlin have had some prominence. But so this is Mark Leidner. What I remember is that he was an extremely cool guy. He was in a very cool band called Mom Sex, which at the time, this was pre-MILF. Like it was a little edgier then. But he was a very funny, very easygoing, very sweet-natured guy. And he also just wrote the fucking funniest poems I had ever read. Like, I remember reading poems of his and thinking like, oh shit, he really knows what he's doing. Like, he has really figured out what it is he's after. And I think Ryan and I, liked poetry and had maybe some ability and were like fumbling through, but like Mark was sort of a fully formed animal. And you could just see, right, like he was already himself. I'm not a big believer in like voice finding in the poetry world. I think it's sort of too much is made of that, but like he had just very clearly found his voice. And went on to Iowa, went on to do a bunch of other stuff, has published a lot of very celebrated poetry, wrote a movie, like a crazy sci-fi thriller, which we didn't even really talk about, called Empathy, Inc. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. To give you an idea of his style, his first book is called Beauty Was the Case That They Gave Me, and the cover is a collage of a basketball player dunking on the Twin Towers. But maybe what that doesn't convey is that it's also very like tender-hearted, very funny poetry. But I enjoyed and admired Mark's work for a long time, and he now has a Substack where he publishes some poetry, publishes some prose, various other things. And I reached out to him. He responded I have to say, I've had a lot of conversations off mic with friends who have been, affiliated with various people of differing degrees of success. And it is pretty common for people who achieve a certain degree of success to to become not necessarily rude, but like inaccessible to their less famous and successful former acquaintances. Mark was wrote back immediately, was incredibly nice and generous. Just like, as you will hear, he is the sweetest man in the world, incredibly down to earth. It also, in editing this episode, clarified to me what an asshole I am because I invited him on and then like made him come up with something to talk about and then spent half of our conversation like arguing about that thing that he suggested we bring in. So, which is to say, we mostly in this main feed episode talk about a wild speech by Toni Morrison. It's her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. It is very strange, and we talk in depth about that. We also talk some about like in what ways it resembles and doesn't resemble Mark's work, and kind of how that works. I should also say Cameron read the speech and had a lot of thoughts about it. I mentioned a couple of them, but they were dense and complex enough that what I suspect is when he gets back from Europe, I will probably dig into it with him on a separate episode. But after the episode, I'm gonna in the outro, what I will do, I think there is I want to read a poem of Mark's to you because I neglected to get him to read one of his own. I'll read one to you just so you can get a little taste of what he writes. And then in the Secret Show episode, we get into a lot of other, I think, pretty juicy stuff. One more quick note. The sound quality of this recording is a little funny because the room that I had been recording in, it turns out, was very nicely insulated by a dense, ancient, and millipede corpse-infested carpet, which we recently had stripped out and replaced with a hard floor. So while Mark's voice is like serene and warm and kind of like the hippie therapist sex symbol voice of your dreams, my voice is like an angry man shouting in an airplane hangar. So I found a new place to record. Shouldn't have the same echo problem, but for this interview, my voice sounds a little odd. All right, with that, I will get to my conversation with Mark Leidner. We are talking about Toni Morrison, but you should go buy Mark's most recent book, which is called Returning the Sword to the Stone, from Phonograph Books, Returning the Sword to the Stone. This is Mark Leidner. You sent this crazy speech, and I confess Toni Morrison is a real hole in my reading. So I read, just to kind of flesh out a little bit, I read the one short story of hers I could find. And it did shed a little light on this, just as like just as like two tiny points on a graph. It does suggest something about her, at least some of what she's sort of interested in narratively, which seems to be a little bit of double-edgedness in a way that is not actually alien to what you do with your poems.
Well, I'm very complimented to be even mentioned in any similarity to her. But it's funny, I discovered this speech that I sent you, which is her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, through my normal job, which is working on textbooks and stuff. And it was just one of the readings that I was editing or working with. And so I had to read it a bunch of times, and I had to write questions about it and write answers to the questions about it. So I have recently spent a lot of time thinking about what it means, although I have not read a ton of Toni Morrison's novels. I read a couple a long time ago and have a vague sense of the feeling they give me and the majesty of their, skill. But I'm not like a Toni Morrison scholar by any stretch of the mark. In fact, I would be like I'm mostly ignorant of her work. But I love this speech, and I think the reason I sent it because I still don't always know what I think about it.
Yeah.
It's elusive to me, and in a way that feels productive. I'm just like assuming what she's saying is incredibly significant, and if I think about it, it will always yield more interesting revelations about why I do what I do, and it so far has done that.
I'm honestly like a little bit surprised that this is a text for, I don't know what age the textbooks are for. Is this high school students, middle school students?
Well, it could be, it's probably high school,
Okay.
but it was probably also chopped up a lot. So
Okay.
what I would be what our textbook would be giving would be something much more concise, perhaps, and like probably with a lot of the nuances removed
Right, right, right.
or shaved off, but could have been college. And the problem is once I work on a textbook, I'll be deeply immersed in, Hamlet for like a month or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever, this speech or some other long string of thematically connected poems. And then as soon as the job is over, it's just
It just,
gone.
yeah,
It's like
I know.
I
Yeah.
I kind of I feel like every time I reread like a Shakespeare play for these textbooks, I like increase my understanding of that play by like 1,000% during the work, and then it goes back down to like
Yeah.
I get like a 5% bonus that long term lasting. But
Do you remember at Georgia there was a requirement that you have to either take a course or pass a test in Georgia history?
oh
And
yeah,
what I remember the path that was set for me by some older kids in the program was you just go to the library and you spend a morning cramming, and then you take the test that afternoon. And I truly remember 0%. Like the next day, it was all gone.
yeah, no, I don't even remember the cramming or how I passed it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I do remember it being this obscure requirement that like, for some of the like frat boys I knew, it was like they're graduating tomorrow and they haven't taken the Georgia history exam or some it's like it trips you up at the last second
Right,
and
right,
like
right.
everybody else does it, the first day or the first semester. Um, but we had a lot of Georgia history in my high school.
You may have been
And
better equipped for it than I was. I
yeah,
went to
so I
like a
feel like,
decade
oh
school.
yeah, Oglethorpe, Savannah, British, whatever, moving on. I felt like I understood it intuitively maybe, but it was not a hard test, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it was truly a blur even at the time for me. But this does seem to me like I was, I was like pretty good at English and language arts stuff as a kid, but this is like a speech like this and questions about it would be totally the kind of thing that I just crashed and burned on. Like anything I've mentioned before in the podcast, like any like what was the author's purpose kind of question just would totally uh, just hamstring me.
I agree. I was a terrible English major in terms of answering questions like that about almost any text, but
But you were
I
actually an English major in college.
I was actually econ, but I was like creative writing
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
minor
was
kind of
drama,
like.
but I did some yeah creative writing classes. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But I did struggle in my English classes in high school and college because I just once you start asking me what are they trying to say, I just was like, I really don't care. I couldn't figure out how to muster up the interest or the power to bullshit my way through. I mean, I definitely did eventually bullshit my way through those answers, but now as a writer, many years later and many like the levels of I think intellectual maturity higher. I love those questions and I like this speech because I really still don't know. There's so many possible answers, and yet they're not infinite. And I think that's a lot of what she is saying is like, the sage's job is not to tell you any answer, it's to provoke an answer that could be maximally meaningful to the person who wants to know or the person who is inclined to agitate for answers or proof or yeah, that's my kind of general reading of both the thesis and also why there seem to be multiple theses in this text.
Yeah, I have a as I said a harebrained theory, but just to give people a little bit of a sense of what we're dealing with, as you mentioned, this is the lecture she gave on receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993, and there is, I mean, I first read it by just listening to her deliver it, or I mean, I assume that was the original delivery. I don't know if it was a later recording, but it is, in a way, it's like she reads or delivers it very well. It is almost precisely what you would imagine it being when you read it. Like she sort of perfectly embodies the delivery of this speech. Do you want to read just the beginning of it, and then maybe we can give people sort of a loose overview of what it is?
Let me see how much I'll read. Okay, I'll read the first few paragraphs. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind but wise. Oh, let me pause here and just say in the audio recording that I also kind of just listened to, there's a preamble before this where she's kind of saying thank you and blah blah blah. But she talks about how this phrase "once upon a time" is, I think she says it's the first phrase that every child knows or remembers, or that every person remembers from childhood. So she's like, pardon me if I begin this speech with that phrase. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind but wise. Or was it an old man, a guru perhaps, or a griot soothing restless children? I have heard this story, or one exactly like it, in the lore of several cultures. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind, wise. In the version I know, the woman is the daughter of slaves, Black American, and lives alone in a small house outside of town. Her reputation for wisdom is without peer and without question. Among her people, she is both the law and its transgression. The honor she is paid and the awe in which she is held reach beyond her neighborhood to places far away, to the city where the intelligence of rural prophets is the source of much amusement. One day, the woman is visited by some young people who seem to be bent on disproving her clairvoyance and showing her up for the fraud they believe she is. Their plan is simple. They enter her house and ask the one question, the answer to which rides solely on her difference from them, a difference they regard as a profound disability, her blindness. They stand before her, and one of them says, "Old woman, I hold in my hand a bird. Tell me whether it is living or dead."
And then
She does not answer. Oh,
sorry,
sorry.
I was gonna
That's
say, well,
good. That's good
there's
enough.
the answer. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the initial setup, and the answer she gives and what it means or doesn't mean, and how they respond, and so on, is the kind of the problem that the rest of the speech doesn't solve, but kind of elaborates. And the answer she initially gives is, I don't know whether the bird you are holding is dead or alive, but what I do know is that it is in your hands. It is in your hands. So this speech is crazy. Like the story is crazy. It's there's this trope in like American movies, and you actually have written at least one movie, and spent time, like you've dealt with narrative and storytelling as much as with poetry. But like there's a trope in American movies, and I mentioned some time ago that I have this pet theory that the Gettysburg Address, which she talks about in this speech, is kind of the origin of this movie trope in
Hmm.
speeches, which is the like, let me give my formal address, and then in the middle, wait. Actually, let me speak from the heart here and say something a little bit less formal and a little more direct, and kind of cut through the stuffiness of that initial beginning. This like the classic moment is like the guy tears up the speech that he's been handed to read from.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. So I love the Gettysburg Address, and in part like it because of the way it plays with tone, and she talks about it's not false humility, but also like cunning humility. And then there's this trope in movies and plays and story, books and things. And then this speech feels to me like she's actually doing that in real time. Like
Hmm.
she's sort of like she's addressing this crowd and initially sort of like presenting them this what feels like they're sitting back in their seats and saying like, we're getting a Toni Morrison's, just the speech we were hoping she would give.
Uh-huh.
And then she's like, to me it feels like she's almost sort of improvising it, and then she starts incorporating these like contradictions and problems, and then she just starts to like, she gets like slightly distracted and like talking about all the implications, and then sort of blows it all up, and like brings the kids back in to say like, no, you've completely misunderstood us, and nothing you've said has any relevance to us. And then they go on a tangent and they tell this like moving but kind of strange story about slaves who are traveling maybe to freedom, maybe to somewhere else. And then at the end, she like, after having like completely disparaged and dismissed these kids, and then they're furious with her, then she says, it's quiet again when the children finish speaking until the woman breaks into the silence. Finally, she says, I trust you now. I trust you with the bird that is not in your hands because you have truly caught it. Look how lovely it is, this thing we have done together. And and then that feels to me like she's completely confused the audience that was like expecting to feel. I don't know if you've ever gone to like a play and heard the audience say like when like a good familiar
Totally.
lesson was delivered and everybody felt like, yes, I am the sort of good person who goes to the theater. Feels like the people who were hoping for that and thinking they were going to get that at the end of this feel like thwarted and befuddled, and then she leaves the stage. So like,
Well,
I don't, yeah, tell me. I'm like, I'm, I've read it a few times and I'm doing, battling with it. But like, yeah, tell me what you make of all this.
I mostly agree with you, except that the at the end, I don't know that we can know how they felt because they might have felt like I did when I first read this speech, which was like, oh shit, this speech is powerful and to me actually describes what it's like to write a poem or what it's like to have an interaction with a reader, whether you meet them or not, an imagined reaction or a real reaction. So I view it as like, at first, she's the instigator. Or they come to her saying, "Hey, give us wisdom, or let me test you, and let's see if you're really as smart as you think you are." And she kind of um, puts it back on them and says that I don't know anything about what you're asking me. All I know is that you hold the bird. So you need to look at yourself first and ask yourself, what am I holding and why do I care and do I care and what is it and what does it mean to me? And then after all the things you described, I think accurately, they have kind of, because she doesn't give in and give them the simple thing that they seem to want, they are provoked. I think that's what literature does sometimes, often, if not always, when it's great. They are provoked into having their own independent thoughts and their imaginations turn on instead of off. And they invent the story that they need to hear and they tell it to themselves. And she's sort of witnessing this story and she's like, great, look what we did together. You came to me really not knowing anything and demanding that I tell you XYZ, or at least trying to prove that I'm either smart or not, or worth listening to or not. And it ended up, you have to find your own poetry and your own literature and your own truth. And then it is, and at the end, it's, we have done this together. And I think like a great play or like a great work of art, the artist puts it out there. You often don't know what to think of it. You think you want one thing from it, you get something else, you think about it a day later, your opinion changes, you talk to 10 other people, your opinion keeps shifting, maybe you go look at it again, and you invent your own critical framework or um, your own person. If you're a poet, if you're me, you go off and write a bunch of other poems that kind of are trying to either steal from or rip off or react to or correct or battle against. And then that is something that we all did together.
I mean, it feels like it's unstable. Like the story she's telling is itself unstable. I only realized that, I think, like going back through it just now, that part of what it reminds me of is Michael Haneke, who's, I've only seen a few of his movies, but great German, I think he's German, not Austrian, German filmmaker who does a lot of different kinds of movies. I think I've seen The Piano Teacher and The White Ribbon and Funny Games. And Funny Games is the most sort of outrageously formally experimental movie where the characters, it's like two sadists toying with this family and they're horrible. And then they literally use a remote control to move the movie around and change things and address the audience directly. And it is a movie that feels like it has a sort of contempt for it, or it has a contempt for a certain impulse in its audience, like
For
the
sure.
impulse to watch people suffer. And this feels a little bit like both this and Recitative, which is the story of hers I read. feel a little bit like it's almost like she has such a moral commitment to the audience that she's willing to, like, there are writers who seem most of all committed to their characters or to their own vision or to their own, sometimes it's like a monologue vision, you know. But then in her
Hmm.
case, it feels like she has she's so much of a moral commitment to the audience that she's willing to sacrifice even the characters. Because like the recitative story is one in which it's sort of two poor girls growing up in an orphanage, and you kind of follow them throughout their lives. And the whole premise of the story basically is that one's black and one's white, and they're kind of thrown together at the beginning, and they find their lives developing in these parallel ways. But the story is written in such a way that you can't ever tell for sure which is which.
Ah, okay.
And I think reading it, I think it's sort of, there is an alignment where like one is black and one is white, but very much like the premise of the story is things keep happening and being spoken and represented in a way that you really can't nail it down. But and yet race continues to come up as a source of friction and like communication between them. And this feels a little bit the same way, that it's like the way I've heard some people, like people who are actually seriously into philosophy instead of the way I'm into everything, which is in a dilettantish way, talk about like Plato's dialogues, where it's not just that Socrates is teaching a lesson and the other guy is saying, oh, oh, oh. It's that there in the better moments there's a conflict that's going on, and the Plato is not actually giving you the answer. He's showing you two people in conflict in proximity to the answer, and you have to work with what you're given there. And then, you know, if you were given an answer, you might just sort of put it down and forget about it. But you're given this kind of slightly like irresolvable conflict, and you have to continue to deal with it when it's left the room.
Yes, I think that from my also probably even more dilettantish study of Socrates and Plato, it's that is what I remember from it, and what I remember my turning on in my brain when I was reading those dialogues or listening to people describe them critically, is that it is an unresolved thing, but it still has an arc. So there's still an interesting shape, and there's
Yeah.
even beginning, middles, and ends, and there's closure, but it's not really the kind of closure that says this is Plato's true opinion, full stop. Like now you know what Plato thinks. It's much more like poetry, where you read a poem, and every time you read it you get a different feeling of or idea of what it might mean depending on where you are in life. And it's like the difference between an argument and art. It's trying to evoke or trying to provoke imaginative light bulbs that come on in different ways and that are unpredictable. I certainly love other stories that do other things, and
Yeah.
poems that do other things, even, and movies that do other things. You know, I love bad movies that are very simplistic but still artfully made and fill you full of good feelings of the heroes winning or the
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever. But the great films or great poems or great stories, they need to push hard, have form, and still have multiple things to say that might even be contradictory, and that you read them as a child, you read them as a adolescent, you read them as a 30-year-old man, you read them as a 60-year-old, whatever, man or woman, whatever, anything, that you get a different answer based on what you bring to it.
It's one of those, like, I mean, as I said, I was like an English major for a, you know, half a year and then dropped out. But like one of those sort of like English major maxims you get is that many, if not most, of the kind of the major, you know, lasting works of literature that we keep coming back to, they're often those in which two different worldviews are colliding, and they're not, and sometimes one is replacing the other, but seldom is one thoroughly seldom is one thoroughly in command the entire time. You know, whether it's the Oresteia, where you have the sort of like the old chthonic feminine gods being replaced by the you know, sun sky, you know, oriented masculine rationalist gods versus the kind of the instinctive ones, or Beowulf, where you have like the pagan and the Christian worlds. And I see some of that here. I also do I was thinking about your poems, and part of what is your poems are they're so funny, but it's also like I was trying to think of is like, how would I explain these to my dad? If you know, and he's not because he's actually like a smart literary guy. He reads things, but like he's not. I suspect that he would not initially get the funniness of them, and I think like I had like a dumb idea like a slightly higher brow idea. The dumb idea is Jack Handy, right? The guy who's
100%.
saying, yeah, like, I mean, which is great. Like like Jack Handy's a genius. It's like very, very funny stuff. He's saying things with a very straight face, as if they're very profound and they're very silly, which is, he himself is doing a kind of an expansion on like Yogi Berra, who was also in his
Hmm.
way a genius. The slightly higher brow example that comes to mind, and I think is probably a little truer, at least to some of the stuff I've read from you, and I follow your Substack, which is sort of like some poems, some prosy things. You had a note the other day that was just like a very straight-faced explanation of why, I hesitate to say you, but like the speaker of the note would have would have been one of the good Nazgul, like would have been one of the evil spirits of Sauron in the Lord of the Rings, who actually like examines his position and realizes that he should really behave in a more. It's sort of like saying like, I would have been against slavery. I would have hidden Jews in my basement during the Holocaust. Like, but the straight facedness of it was the genius. The highbrow example that came to mind was Polonius in Hamlet. Like, because the thing about Polonius, again, is like he is a fool. He's giving this advice, to thine own self be true. In fact, like that's the line I think that begins your movie, right? To thine own self be
Hmm.
true. And it's a speech that's famously full of like self contradictions and flaws. And he's a hypocrite, and he doesn't follow his own advice, and he's grabbing any cliche that's close to that he can possibly get his hands on. But also, some of it is quite beautiful, and some of it is quite. It's not actually just that he's a dum dum; it's that he's sort of an eloquent fool, and that feels like the mode of a lot of your poems. And this feels like this speech, in a way, is a sort of a. It feels like it's challenging people who knew what they wanted to get from this by sort of like continually puncturing every expectation as the speech goes along. Like part of me
Yeah,
imagined that she was improvising this as she went. With like, like in the stoner movie of this, it would be like, oh no, I forgot I won the Nobel Prize. I have to give a speech, and like it all. I mean, she's clearly a little more sophisticated than that, but like it almost has that kind of like chaotic touch to it, and obviously like it ends on a very like rich and lyrical, strange narrative note, but it has some of that like,
yeah.
is it serious quality to it.
It's I I I think I agree with all of that, and I definitely will. I'm grateful for the descriptions of my own poetry as a slightly smarter than you think fool or whatever. Like Polonius, great, I'll take it. But yeah, there is something of the fool and the sage, which I think Toni Morrison is definitely not the fool, but they're often, again, it's so self-aggrandizing for me to even think about me and Toni Morrison as like we're on the same team. But I
You're
would
playing a
I would
similar game.
love
Yeah.
I would love to be considered that by other people. I don't know if I could have the guts to say that, but um but the sage and the fool both provoke. They both don't tell you everything you want to know when you want to know it. They they are, I think, rhetorically keyed in to audience purpose, expectation, undercutting expectation. Because if they don't do those things, you don't really listen. People don't listen to anything, I don't think, unless you really can command a context around the thing to be said, or like Gettysburg Address, to go back to that
Yeah,
speech.
yeah.
It's
We
very
can,
much,
if you want, we can read the little passage where she mentions that, if it's useful.
sure. But let me just
Yeah, yeah.
say
Sorry. Go ahead. Go
that
ahead.
many great speeches and many great poems, and almost every poem, I would argue, you know there's the language that gets you in, and then there's a turn, and then the turn is not what is the begin. It's not the same as the beginning. There's some value shift, often or usually. Um, and especially if you're working in like a classic kind of like, I'm going to communicate an idea to an audience or to a reader. Now I'm sure there's like extremely experimental forms of poetry that kind of don't participate in this, but probably even those have more abstract quote turns. So it's really, you know, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Like, what a great opening for a. That's not what he's going to do.
Right.
You know
Yeah.
that by
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
end of these whatever, however many lines, he's going to redirect all that goodwill and giving you what you want into a completely more different and provocative and world-changing idea. And so I think, joke tellers, it's a setup and punchline. Sages, it's some version of what Toni Morrison does, which is let me once upon a time you real quick.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, oh, wait, this once upon a time is different. This one asks a lot more of me than I was wanting or expecting, perhaps. Although I would still argue that, like, the audience of the Nobel Prize, probably there's a bunch of, like you say, bougie people who just want to like be seen there and
Yeah.
clap
Yeah.
like little platitudes. But maybe many of them were sages themselves, like, wow, this is a great speech. Finally, we got a great speech. But yeah, I don't think there's that there's a kind of kinship between foolishness and actual wisdom. Um, and I'm definitely more on the foolish side. But Jack Handy is definitely let's go back to the Gettysburg Address. I don't need to
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
Jack.
Yeah. And Andy Kaufman obviously is another example, though.
Yes,
Sometimes a little more like confrontational than Jack Handy.
totally. And within that paradigm, you can push the provocation lever, all the way to 11, or you can like turn it down to 1, or you can push the accessible everybody. I want to be liked by everybody lever all the way up or all the way down, and you can push the wisdom lever. I'm going to really hit them with something brutally, devastatingly wise and unexpected, or I'm going to deny them that. I'm going to promise that and then deny that as long as possible and never give it to them. So there's a big range, I think, of types of clown or fool. I like the fool, like
Yeah.
the jester in Lear or whatever his name is. The fool is his name,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, and
um,
I mean, even in I was gonna say even in Hamlet, Hamlet himself plays foolish. Or in the if you, in Amleth, what I hadn't realized is like in Hamlet, he puts on an antic disposition. He acts crazy. In Amleth, in the source text, he acts like developmentally disabled. He acts like he's like was
uh,
like has like congenital problems with his brain in
well,
order to make himself not seem like a threat. But yeah, so that when she mentions the Gettysburg Address, she says, when a president of the United States thought about the graveyard his country had become, and he is dedicating the soil to this particular patch of the battlefield to a graveyard, and said, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here. His simple words are exhilarating in their life-sustaining properties because they refuse to encapsulate the reality of 600,000 dead men in a cataclysmic race war, refusing to monumentalize, disdaining the final word, the precise summing up, acknowledging their poor power to add or detract. His words signal deference to the uncapturability of the life it mourns. It is the deference that moves her, that recognition that language can never live up to life once and for all, nor should it. Language can never pin down slavery, genocide, war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so. Its force, its felicity is in its reach toward the ineffable. I think I almost entirely follow and agree with her claims about the Gettysburg Address. And then I'm very ambivalent about her conclusions about language. I mean, yeah, not that I think language can pin down whatever that would mean, slavery, genocide, and war, but I'm always ambivalent about like writers disparaging the power of language. Like, it would say like,
hmm.
oh, well, language fails, language can't live up to this, Language is a even it was funny. Like I sent because it's a for two reasons. One, again, one dumb and one slightly higher brow. I sent this speech to one of the co-hosts of the show, Cameron, both because he loves to make very presumptuous pronouncements about literature and language overall, but also gets really angry when other people do, and because he is blind and has an obsession with like representations of blind people.
uh,
But his response to this was mostly like, "Oh no, 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 she doesn't understand language at all." And then he launched into this essay about what language is, and I thought, well, that's crazy and wrong as well. But it did. I mean, if anything, it was a demonstration. Like, well, if the goal of this is to provoke people to really, really think about what language is, it seems to be doing that. It seems to be succeeding on that front.
yeah, that's that when you were describing that reaction, I was like, well, again, like in some sense, the system works. I think I
He
don't
also
know if
mentioned Kafka, which was the parallel you brought up. He said, "Oh, this sends me back to Kafka."
is that a welcome send back
Oh no, he
or
loves
an
Kafka. Yeah,
unwelcome?
he
Okay,
specifically
okay.
mentioned Kafka's. He has a couple little lines about the Tower of Babel, which is another one of her. Though her treatment of the Tower of Babel seems like, again, I don't know how many like layers of quotation marks it's in, but she presents this like fascinating interpretation of the Tower of Babel that seems like, again, like almost like a purposefully backwards wrong interpretation. Like it's purposefully reading the whole story inside out in a way that's like kind of like, I don't know, sort of fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you this: it's it's hard to get any true, quote accurate interpretation of, to me, the Tower of Babel or the Gettysburg Address, because like I don't know the last time you read the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. It is very, to me, I recently read it
It's been a
and I
couple
remember
years.
thinking like, huh, this isn't exactly what I thought it was. And I've also one time taught a world lit class, like the one time I did, and I don't remember anything about that class, but we did read the story of the Tower of Babel, and I found some
Mm.
scholar who's like, here's the original version, and here's the way they brought it in, and here's what people know, and it was just very complicated, and it's like you turn the prism around and the lesson is completely different. You turn it another way, the lesson changes again. And it's it just makes me think that any I don't want to say any interpretation. I do not agree that any interpretation is equally valid as any
Sure, sure,
others.
sure.
Some have evidence and some don't.
Yeah,
But I think of a lot of the times that we think we understand a text, it's because we've inherited that understanding, and
yeah,
you
yeah,
actually read the text and you're like, wait a minute. Not only is this story not what I thought it was, I can see how you might pull that out,
yeah, yeah,
but there's this other opposite possibility. And also, I don't even think the story is interesting. So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
there's many, I don't know. I feel like our understanding of anything historical or ancient in terms of literature is it's always alive and bubbling, and we often don't even look at it because we're like, oh, I read that 20 years ago. I know what that's
Yeah.
about. And then
Well, here, I mean, as you said, who knows where this originated? But I have the little passage from Genesis. It's not too long, so I could read
let's
it.
do
Because
it.
the part of what I loved about what she did with it is that it was not it's almost, again, it feels almost like a Mark Leidner poem. She said like, well, obviously the traditional interpretation is, and then she gave like a totally crazy idiosyncratic
uh
interpretation, and then she said, oh, but that's wrong. Here's what like it like she sort it's again it's like it was like it was as if it was not even the same story. Like it's which again is just like a great rhetorical trick. Here's the just from Genesis in the King James version. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So it's definitely not the image that is often presented of like God throwing a lightning bolt and bringing down a tower. That seems to be, it's a much more elegant solution. It's almost like a neutron bomb. Like he doesn't, it's like, I don't have to blow up your tower. I'm just going to deeply fuck with your sense of reality by changing how you talk.
And also, I always feel like when this story is told in like little kid Bibles and like even in pop culture, it's like those naughty people, they were building a tower to try to like match heaven, and they were trying to like get too much in, they were trying to get the internet really high up in the sky, and like they were doing something technological that was not allowed. But at no
Right.
point in the story, as you're reading it, do you realize what they're doing is at all wrong, and it actually sounds kind of nice.
Yeah.
They're just like, hey, why don't we work together and like build something? And actually, then people won't come in and murder us because we'll kind of have this protection, or we'll have this citadel. And then, and God's like, oh, yeah, it sounds like almost God's like, and then that's kind of cool. But actually, I'm just going to mess with you and just to disrupt this. And it doesn't say why he disrupted it. It just says, I guess he
He
says,
doesn't want them. Nothing will be restrained from them. Like basically, like they're going to be. I mean, what it reminds me of is the line in
and that
Genesis where he says, "Now they will become like us." Like now that they have the knowledge of good and evil, they will become like us. So like, I gotta fuck this. Like I gotta put an end to
isn't
this.
that so strange? It runs so, it makes God seem so,
Oh,
I always
horrible! He's
thought,
a total
well,
tyrant.
tyrant, but also like I always thought that it was impossible. It was by definition
Right,
impossible
right,
for
right.
us to reach him. So
Yeah,
why is he so worried about that? I just don't, I really don't comprehend the, and I'm not criticizing the real God here. I'm just saying here's part of this story that I may very well believe is the word of God that I just am too ignorant to understand. But I just don't understand why he's so insecure about human power. Now, if he was like, hey, I love humanity, and if they do that, they're going to ruin their own lives, and now I'm going to slap them back down, I'm like, great, thank you. That's what we need. But if it's just like, oh, they might get too smart and be too capable, I'm like, well, it's a hard ask, because it's like you made us this way. But anyway,
There's the image that, I mean, I don't know if it may be like the flood where there are like lots of sources, and the original source is just a bunch of people living in the same part of the world and it flooding every season. But there's the image in Greek myth of the Titans piling one mountain on top of another in order to reach up to the sky, and Zeus having to say like, no, 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 we're not doing that anymore. Fuck that. And I mean, even I think it's even mentioned in like when Hamlet is doing the hilarious speech. Like it's like a totally grotesque moment where he's like jumping into Ophelia's grave, and he's like fighting with Laertes over which of them loved her more, and he's like makes this line about like, I'll pile a mountain on top of me in her grave to show I loved her more. You know, but it's that same image. The line I did like from Kafka, that because he had a couple little things he said, but the line I did like was, if it had been possible to build the tower without ascending it, then its construction would have been permitted. Which is like one of his like perfect
so
paradoxical like
Kafka,
catch
it's great.
22s that he, yeah. But yeah, it does it's, I mean, like the genius of this, and the reason this is like, this story is much stickier than the Greek one, is the ingenious insight that like by dividing people by language, you change their ability to organize. I did like Cameron, the guy, our co-host, that he's like, he likes getting very angry, so he got very angry at the whole thing. But then like he as well. So like the good Lord, the end is really beautiful and strange
Okay.
and like sort of mysterious. Like it's in a way it's the most riveting part of this part of the story because it becomes a real story. It becomes like a richly told little excerpt from a scene, and it almost feels like the proof of the pudding's in the tasting. Like she's gotten up on stage to give a speech about the Nobel Prize, and you could do like what Harold Pinter did, which is like a straight ahead political speech, which is fine. What, like, you're Harold Pinter, you get to do that. That's fine, you know. But she sort of gives this meta speech, and then at the end, it's almost like she's saying, even though at this point I'm in the mouths of the like cynical children, what if I just start telling a story? And like, aren't stories really good? The
Mm-hmm.
end.
You know, sometimes that is the poet. I mean, I sometimes think that that is what quote true poetry is that, you know what, everyone in this world inherits understanding and forms and meanings and interpretations, and what a true poet does is they walk in, they absorb whatever they can, and they realize there's sort of like Wizard of Oz, like the wizard is just some dude behind the curtain pulling strings with like a bunch of smoke and mirrors, and it's like, you know what, actually I'm just going to decide what the truth is, and I'm going to try to project it into the world. And you know what, if it's wrong, or if it's flawed, or if it's contradictory, or not to everyone's taste, like, you know what, everything is like that.
Yeah.
If you unpeel every layer, there's no like one true truth that is always objectively understood. And I think that's a poet, that's what you get. What, to me, that's when a writer is very exciting, is when they are, I will forgive them a lot if they are,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, legislating reality with
Well,
their words and their wisdom.
but also that like it's part of what makes a good story really good or a good poem really good is that it's not reducible to its wisdom statement. That you can't say, well, what he's really trying to say, or the message she's delivering here is, you know, again, it's to take, you know, Cleanth Brooks. If you can really paraphrase it, then it's not, it's probably not a poem.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all hate about bad poems, is that they reduce reality to a single like quote truth, or their stance, even if they don't have a thesis statement at the end, they have a stance that is not real, is too artificial or too simplistic to be believed. And
But that's
so
sort of why
yeah.
I love giving this to like children with questions. It almost feels like it's like giving like interior designers like an Escher painting. You're like just do the sketch the layout of this space.
No, it's funny because in a lot of textbooks you have a, you know, Hamlet is in a high school textbook. I read that play in high school. I'm like,
Yeah, yeah, me too.
how did I even it, I think about this all the time. Should Shakespeare be taught to high school students who have really very limited, most of them, at least if they're lucky, have limited understanding of mortality and adulthood and grief and all that? And I go back and forth. I mean, if I hadn't been exposed to Hamlet so early, I certainly received almost none of it. None of its wisdom and truth did it
Yeah,
penetrate, but it did make me think a little bit. It was like a drug you give. What's that word? A gateway drug. I
yeah.
developed a taste
Yeah,
for it, I guess. Or like I was like, oh, I'm aware of this thing, and like I kind of know this really famous story, so that like 10, 15 years later, when I had experienced life, I could read it again and be like, oh my God, this is the truest thing I've ever read.
yeah.
So it's
But that's like to me that's like most like people I know who like stuck with writing in the long term take like at least early on a lot of the pleasure was like I know I love this, I can't tell you what it means. And like even Robert Penn
right.
Warren said that when he was in college about the wasteland, which was my experience of the wasteland, and basically still is my experience of the waste. Like this is so cool, this sounds so great, this is so amazing, I can follow parts of it, and I could probably give you a smartish sounding statement about what's going on. But like, it's just good. It's just like, you know, in Hamlet, you know, I spent maybe more time with, maybe have a slightly better rational account of, but like, you know, you can totally fall in love with something without being able to hold it all in your head in any meaningful way.
Well, yeah, and I think that, this does make sense in context of an entire textbook that you might give to,
Sure, sure, sure.
high schoolers. Like, give them one little slice of just raw, very accessible and yet very challenging to interpret
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
storytelling or nonfiction, whatever it is. Probably no other essay in that whole book is going to be. Everything else is going to be either an op-ed or a short story with a,
Right. Yeah,
blah,
yeah,
blah, blah,
yeah.
blah. Joe Schmo was 45 when he went through his divorce and blah, blah, blah. So this is a little more, it's okay for me. It's like, I think it would be helpful for some exposure to for the kids to get some, wise Toni Morrison storytelling that is ambiguous.
Yeah, and it has a little bit of like a Zen koan quality where it's like it sticks in your mind and you can't quite get. It's like a Klein bottle or a Mobius strip. Like I can't quite solve this thing.
Yeah, it really feels like a literal Zen story from, whatever tradition where, like, the villagers went to the wise person and they asked them, what is this bird, dead or alive? And usually that story ends two sentences later with, like, huh.
Right.
But it's just an exploded version of that with
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
way more tendrils and
Yeah.
connections that to other things.
Yeah,
But
because the Zen story would similarly not answer the kids' questions. It would probably the difference would be she would
right.
like whack them on the head with a frying pan or something at the end, and they would become enlightened. But
Sure.
there's a lot of like the Zen are very into like whacking you with a stick to provoke you.
Yeah.
She does, yeah, she does it
But it's
much better.
also always the end is like, oh, I don't, the master doesn't know. And the student's like, oh, shit.
That was the first half of my conversation with Mark Leidner, author of Returning the Sword to the Stone, among many other things. So in the second half of the conversation, we talk about Kafka, we talk about the contemporary poetry landscape and our sort of very different vantage points on it. We talk about the relationship between poetry and other art forms and sort of the ways in which we've been inspired by non-poetic precedents. We talk about formalism, good, bad, and otherwise, as well as some competing theories of how to break a line. Mark explains, I think in a very illuminating way, his approach to formal rigor, which is I think so like which he approaches very seriously, but in a radically different way than I do, and I think most listeners to the show probably do. And sorry, sorry to all the Aussies out there. I asked Mark if he had read anything really good recently, and he named a Kiwi. So you will find out Mark's favorite New Zealand poet at the end of that episode as well. Before I sign off, though, I thought I would, because in the conversation, Mark mentioned a couple times Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and he specifically referred to Mark Antony's, eulogy for Caesar, in which he riles up the crowd while protesting that that's not what he's doing. There's another speech in the same play that Antony gives to Caesar directly, to Caesar's corpse rather. This speech was the inspiration for a poem of Mark's that I want to read you, but I figured I would at least read you a little bit of the Shakespeare. All right, so this is Antony speaking to Caesar's corpse. "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth." This speech is like blood chilling, by the way. Like this is like the darkest speech imaginable, except for maybe I'm reading Job right now, and there's some real bleak stuff in there as well. But this is Antony to Caesar's corpse. "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy, which like dumb mouths do ope their ruby lips, to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. A curse shall light upon the limbs of men. Domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Italy. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war, all pity choked with custom of fell deeds, and Caesar's spirit, ranging for revenge, with Ate by his side come hot from hell, shall in these confines with a monarch's voice cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war, that this foul deed shall smell above the earth with carrion men groaning for burial. So that's Mark Antony. That's Shakespeare's Mark Antony addressing Caesar, and this is this is Mark Leidner. The last time I tried to read a Mark Leidner poem on this podcast, I failed because I couldn't stop laughing. So I suspect it's going to take me a couple takes to get through this, but I think it'll be worth it. This is Dogs of War by Mark Leidner. I hate it when someone lets slip the dogs of war, and I lambast them publicly for that. But at the last second, they yank the dogs back by their chains, and the sad dogs cry out before slinking faithfully back to their master, and don't end up going to war after all. And now my public indictment of the person I thought was going to let slip the dogs of war is just hanging out there. And since indictments don't have chains, I can't yank it back. And everyone is staring at me, because it looks like I just accused someone of letting slip the dogs of war when they technically didn't. And the only dogs in sight are panting amiably in orderly rows alongside the person I accused, their leashes slack, their teeth concealed. Even their tails are wagging, sweeping the floor like brooms. Suddenly, these dogs look so little like dogs of war, lettable to be slipped by anyone, that I look like a psycho for suggesting so, and their master in his magnificent 10-piece suit leering at me, my eyes wide in fear because I'm realizing why he pretended to let slip the dogs of war in the first place. To find out who would cry out in protest if he did, and it was me. That's when a new set of dogs of war gets let slipped. The dogs of war of those watching from the sidelines, hoping to find someone who everyone saw be publicly wrong to let slip their own dogs of war on, in this case, me, for my half-cocked condemnation of the original fake dogs of war slipping guy. Now I'm the one with the dogs of war getting slipped on me, and all I have is about 15 seconds to make peace with myself and how I lived my life, and who I am. And thankfully, I am able to do it, because I'm young enough not to have lived so long that it takes a long time to make peace with the things I regret, and I finish making peace with myself just in time, before being torn apart by the real dogs of war. It's so fast that even if I did have my own dogs to let slip in response, I would not have had time, making the dogs that were let slipped on me not really dogs of war at all. If someone is murdered before they can retaliate, it's not a war. So the dogs that do it are not dogs of war, is my next to last thought. There are no true dogs of war in this story, being my last. All right, that was Mark Leidner. You can hear the second half of our conversation on The Secret Show. Go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, put in your email address, and I'll give you a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. If you would love to listen, but you have genuine financial difficulty affording it, then just write me a note at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com, and I will hook you up. If you have some extra expendable income and you would like to support the show and others listening to it, then sign up to be Motherfucker of the Arts. It is a little more expensive, and, write me a note. See what, I don't know what perks the Motherfuckers of the Art should have. You can help me figure that out. Again, that is SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Go sign up today. Go listen to our conversation and then go buy Mark's book, Returning the Sword to the Stone. He's got another collection coming out in the next year or so, and I'm hoping to get him back. Thank you for listening. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.